All right, Tony. So where are we off to?
Okay, so a couple of weeks ago, I went to a meeting in Ladywell, not far from here, on the Ukraine war. Very interesting meeting, and two of the people were there, Alex Gordon and Kate Hudson, gave out a copy of this Alternative Defence Review, which I recommend to everybody to get hold of. You can download it free on the CND site. It's set up to counter the massively pro-war narrative that's been pumped out, has been pumped out ever since Boris Johnson took over, and is continuing to be pumped out by Keir Starmer and his government. So I'm going to go into them in the famous left-wing bookshop of Housemans, North London. Should be great. Really looking forward to it.
Okay, lovely, fantastic.
Cool.
Well, let's go.
Let's go.
Yeah.
I'd like to welcome Alex Gordon and Kate Hudson. So we like to start with a bit of personal information. So I don't know if you could both perhaps introduce yourselves and your background, how you got into, let's call it left-wing politics. And then I'd really like to know how you got the idea of writing with other people. I can see on this fascinating Alternative Defence Review how you got the idea of writing this defence review. Kate, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm a lifelong lefty, but for the purposes of talking about this, I'd say that my activity has primarily, at least for the last 25 years, been in the peace movement, the anti-war movement. I had been involved in Greenham and CND in the 1980s, you know, out there against the missiles, mass movement. But then at the end of the Cold War, the missiles went away and I kind of lapsed out of that and did some other things. And then towards the end of the 90s, I thought, post-Cold War, there's been a lot of hype about, you know, New World Order, peace and loveliness and all that kind of thing. That didn't seem to be happening because NATO was expanding, missile defence, you know, the Star Wars thing was coming to Britain, and wars seemed to be kind of on the up. So I thought, better get back involved in CND, which I did, and that's been my main area of political work, campaigning, ever since. So, of course, in that process, I've got to know people like Alex and others who coming from the trade union movement, but of course there is a strong tradition in the trade union movement of peace as well as socialism. So we share that view, peace and socialism together, and that's how we got talking and the idea for the Alternative Defence Review arose.
Great.
My background is a bit similar to Kate's, actually. I mean, I was sort of brought up in a family where my mother went to Greenham Common. The family was taken out to Lakenheath and Alconbury Air Force bases to visit peace camps, and I was a member of Youth CND when I was a teenager, and you know, both my parents were Labour Party members, and so it would have been, you know, in the 1970s that was a sort of not standard, but it was a fairly widespread, popular position of left-wing politics around the peace movement and sort of progressive politics. And I suppose that has affected me deeply. It's sort of affected my outlook on life. And I've been fortunate to be part of a trade union, the RMT, the National Union of Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers, which has had a very progressive tradition and a progressive leadership and has been affiliated to CND for many years, and was one of the unions that helped to set up and took part in the Stop the War coalition after the around the invasion of Iraq. My working life as a trade unionist, I've been able to draw on those deep links with the peace movement, as Kate says, peace and socialism, and I think that that's more relevant now for the reasons that we articulate, hopefully, in the Alternative Defence Review, than it has been for many, many years.
This review, what's going on in the world now that demands this kind of response?
Well,
where do we start? Where do we start?
Yeah, I mean, it's well, everyone says we're in a kind of polycrisis. There are crises on every front, you know, in terms of people's lives, in terms of the climate, escalation of nuclear weapons, breakdown of kind of social infrastructure and the fabric of society, massive anti-immigrant and anti-refugee sentiment, rise of the far right, you know, everything you could possibly think of. And at the same time, continuing wars generally initiated by the West, you know, the United States, Britain, its loyal poodle trotting along there behind, or they're the result of centuries of European colonialism, and that kind of still continuing to play out, resource wars and so on. And so when the Labour government got in, and one of the first things that Keir Starmer did was commission a strategic defence review, right? There was nothing to suggest he was going to do anything to break from that whole pro-war framework, you know, more war framework, you know, that Boris Johnson and others had really kind of doubled down on. Nothing to suggest that at all. So therefore, we felt very strongly when we were talking about it backstage after, you know, during a demo, there's got to be some change. We have to have an alternative that's posed. Otherwise, it's just the pro-war narrative, it's the military spending narrative. You know, we need to have an alternative that will arm people with the information, the arguments, the facts and figures to go out there and say, no, actually, this isn't the answer. Either it doesn't provide security, genuine security for people. It's not the answer to jobs. It's not the answer to economic problems. All the nonsense we're being told by the Labour government, you know. So we wanted to put an alternative out there.
Those of us on the left have really noticed has developed over the last few years, but particularly under this new Labour government, is what you might call the new war narrative. Where do you think, and how do you think that's developed, that new war narrative, and how it affects us?
In chapter 1, I think it is, we look at where the pro-war narrative comes from, and you can see it quite specifically being brought into British politics around about 2020. During COVID, I mean, ironically, as somebody says, the person who wrote that section of the Alternative Defence Review says, at a time when there were almost no wars going on in the world, because COVID had shut down most military conflicts, at least overt military conflicts. So this goes back specifically to the Boris Johnson premiership. And we think that what clearly happened at this point, or at least what we're suggesting in the Alternative Defence Review, is that what happened at this point is that elements within the British Conservative Party, who we've identified as being the militarist wing or the militarist tendency within the British Conservative Party, took a move away from the strategic position that had been outlined by previous Conservative Prime Ministers under Cameron and Osborne when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. And at that time, the Cameron-Osborne strategic defence documents took advantage of the peace dividend to cut back on a lot of the on a lot of military spending. They still made sure that they oiled the wheels of the big corporations. We were still spending obscene amounts of public money on floating tin cans, aircraft carriers that can't get out of the River Solent and are basically just sitting targets. As somebody says in the Alternative Defence Review, I think that's a quote from a senior military officer. But the overall trend after austerity came in 2010 was that they wanted to try and reduce where they could defence spending. Now, when Johnson came in 2020, or at least during the COVID period, there's a distinct flip away from that. And we start seeing these demands from senior Tories for huge increases in military spending. They start talking about Britain being a pre-war society, and this is a really chilling phrase, which I think is used by Grant Shapps, great intellectual of the Tory right, who said we're no longer living in a post-war society in Britain, we're now living in a pre-war society. I mean, think about that.
So, what you said just there about the change when Johnson came into power, what do you think triggered that change at the heart of the Tory party, which was then picked up, obviously, by the Labour Party since? Was there a specific thing that changed it?
Kate might have a different take on this. I think there are two particular issues that I'd identify. One is the fact that we'd left the European Union, and there was all of this debate going on inside the Conservative Party about Britain as a global player. Now that we're out of the EU, we're going to be the Singapore of the North Sea. We're going to project ourselves on the world stage. There was all this sort of pompous imperialist talk. But the other really important issue, which is, in my view, fundamental, is the influence of United States neocon politicians, business interests, and state intelligence assets who have totally infiltrated the British state and are responsible for importing a very developed American war narrative into our politics in this country.
I mean, I would put the emphasis very significantly on the US thing, because in terms of post-Cold War, US policy post-Cold War, it was very clear from the early 1990s that they were determined to remain the sole superpower.
Sure.
They experienced it and they liked it and they thought that they would continue with that. So their policy ever since the early 1990s has been oriented to prevent a kind of a rival coming up. From quite early on, they had China in their sights. They knew what was happening with the Chinese economic reforms and the massive expansion and stuff going on there. And I think they were literally wargaming against China, from a kind of decade or so into the Cold War, if not the end of the Cold War, if not before. So that was their focus and their orientation. I mean, as Alex said, during the Cameron-Osborne period here, that was not taken up in that kind of way. And once the US, in the kind of, pre-2020 or whatever, had started all its stuff at the UN and all this about, the kind of authoritarian axis and Russia and China and all that, they just started to buy into that, But Boris Johnson was obviously the key, as Alex has pointed out. I mean, and in terms of the shift, within the kind of Tory framework, it's particularly marked with nuclear weapons, because when Cameron came in, the coalition government, he announced a big reduction in nuclear warheads. One of the first things that Boris Johnson did was announce a big increase in nuclear warheads. That was a complete reversal of post-Cold War policy. So going along with the United States, it's kind of anti-China thing, the whole integrated review from Boris Johnson, during his PM-ship, that was all the kind of orientation against China and the kind of Indo-Pacific tilt and all that kind of stuff, So just poodling along really behind the US, and that's what they will continue to do, even if it takes us into a complete global meltdown and disaster.
Sure. This has to be sold. This has to be sold to us, the public. You talk about MEMAC, I think was the phrase you used in the meeting in Ladywell. Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. MEMAC is, I don't know if I invented that.
It's a good one.
But yeah, I'll claim it.
Yeah.
It's the military industrial media academic complex. It's an attempt to obviously describe in a horribly simplistic way this all-enveloping network that is preparing the population psychologically, sociologically, politically and militarily for war, for a world war. And one of the things that we saw happening in that period between 2020 and where we are now is Britain played a very important role, as Kate has alluded to, in support of US war aims. And one of the things that I think is underestimated and hasn't really been explained sufficiently is how it came to be that two countries in Europe which had been neutral since the Second World War, namely Finland, Finland became neutral partway through the Second World War. Finland and Sweden joined NATO. Now, the explanation that's given for this is that they were so terrified by Russia's invasion of sovereign Ukrainian territory in February 2022 that this caused them to join the NATO defensive alliance. but it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. The job of getting Finland and Sweden into NATO, Britain played a very, very important role in brokering that. And I think that to understand what Britain's relationship is to the United States, it's not simply a vassal, although it is a vassal. It's more than that. It's been a key loyal persuader. So throughout the 1960s and 70s, after the formation of the European Economic Community, the Americans wanted Britain in the EEC, which became the European Union. It was, American politicians overtly advocated for that. There was some debate about it in this country. Eventually we went in the 1970s. And Britain was, as a member of the EU, of the EEC, acted very much as a portal for US banks. After the Big Bang in the City of London in 1983, it became a portal for US banks to go into the European market. Similarly today, although we're not in the European Union, we left the European Union, within NATO, Britain plays this extremely important role as a persuader, as somebody who, and you can see that British politicians and senior military officials have been the most bellicose, the most zealous advocates of an offensive war strategy against Russia in the last 3 or 4 years, while the Ukrainian war has been happening in earnest. So I think we need to look, we need to really unpack the role of this MIMAC, this military-industrial media academic complex, which covers universities, newspapers. I mean, there's almost no alternative viewpoint in the mainstream British press or mainstream British broadcasting. In the 1970s, in the 1980s, we had independent journalists. We had people like, John Pilger. We had people, writing in the Daily Mirror about the Vietnam War. We had, great exclusive investigative reports on what was going on with US imperialism and Britain's attempt to tail US imperialism. Now, where is that today? It's been squeezed out of the mainstream press. One of the reasons you guys are doing this is because there's this huge appetite out there amongst intelligent people who've got an independent ability to analyse what's going on in front of them, and they're not getting the analysis that they need from the mainstream media. So all of this is part now of this expanding military industrial complex. It's gone into the media, it's gone into universities. We have schools that have arms companies going in, explaining to kids how this is a great future working in the arms business. It's being sold to us in a really as a package in almost every avenue of our conscious lives.
So it seems to me that everything is being geared towards this assault on any ideas of peaceful coexistence. How effective do you think their program is now in persuading the people of this country? All right, they seem to have done a job in Sweden, but what about in this country? How effective do you think the government and their allies in the press and education, and how effective do you think it is?
Well, I wouldn't want to overstate it. I mean, obviously, Starmer describes it as a whole society approach to kind of, preparation for war, and that is clearly their intention. And as you say, there's a kind of, from the mainstream media, almost a kind of blanket, whatever. But then when you get to opinion polls, you consistently see people are obviously thinking for themselves, and when you go on demonstrations and so on, almost 2 years now since the genocide on Gaza began, with our government, their whole narrative, completely discredited really the government's position and narrative on this, their criminal approach, and a mass movement and a growing mass movement, a very diverse mass movement against that, because people can see that the government is doing wrong, and on many other issues as well. I mean, there was a very interesting poll recently which showed only 36% of them thought that NATO was a necessary and important, military thing. So that and that age range, that category tends to be pretty progressive and questioning about a whole range of stuff, things that we would also have the same concerns about. So people are thinking for themselves. Some are thinking for themselves and coming to what I would consider to be the wrong conclusions, but people by no means just accept that dominant narrative, and that's always been the same, across societies, in my view. The depths of the Cold War, people were standing up and thinking for themselves. And although the mainstream media is pretty universally bad, there are alternative outlets and so on. So you mentioned investigative journalism, Declassified UK, for example, and others producing massively useful and revelatory information that challenge the whole structure of what the government's doing. And the movement's, strong, increasingly strong, ordinary people standing up against the, repression of the right to protest, So I don't think it's all doom and gloom. We've certainly got a big challenge, but I feel very strongly that we can rise to the challenge, and we can find diverse ways, new and different ways of breaking it down.
Perhaps one of the proofs of that is that the government, unable to rely on its ideological arguments, is turning to this wonderful idea of military Keynesianism, which is where they're trying to present this as the answer to the austerity, the secular decline of the British economy, the idea that 5% of our budget should go on defence spending. I mean,
5% of GDP.
GDP should
it's
go
far
on
more than 5%
sorry,
of the budget.
5 GDP. Merz, Chancellor Merz in Germany has said publicly that we can't afford a welfare state anymore. Now, Starmer hasn't come out and said that, but effectively that is the reality of it. How do you see this military Keynesianism? What are the arguments that you've used to kind of undermine that idea that we can spend our way buying missiles and warships and whatever to prosperity in this country?
Well, I mean, I'll touch on that in just a second, but just to say you can see how effective Merz's argument in Germany is. There have been massive demonstrations by young people against the threat of military conscription. Merz's popularity is now
sinking like a stone.
The party that's now getting the highest percentage in the opinion polls is the party of the extreme right, AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, which has a position of wanting to get out of funding the war in Ukraine. So draw your own conclusions. German politics are not my speciality, but clearly that argument in Germany isn't going down very well. And I think the same thing is happening here. The idea that we're going to be able to rebuild jobs, rebuild economic growth through massive state investment. I mean, they're talking about 2.5% of GDP rising to 2.7% of GDP by the end of this parliament, and then 3% in the next parliament. That's the promise. Trump, of course, has got them to promise 5% of GDP. They haven't yet articulated that as a government policy, but no doubt they will. These numbers are mind-boggling. These numbers cannot generate economic growth because the jobs that they're going to be creating are going to be jobs provided by US arms companies, and Trump has made it clear where he wants those jobs to be. If there's a choice between building a nuclear submarine in Barrow and building it in New Jersey or San Diego, it's going to be built in the United States. So this is a barren policy. It's a completely, this is not a genuine policy about boosting economic demand. That argument fails on two grounds. One, when you build weapons of war, you're not building demand. You're building destruction, the ability to destroy people, buildings, and other infrastructure. But secondly, of course, those jobs aren't going to be here anyway, and you can see that in the arguments that are playing out around the new European fighter, the Typhoon, which it looks like is going to be wound up as a project because the Americans want the Europeans to buy F-35s rather than developing their own Eurofighter Typhoon. So this whole thing is nonsense. It's got nothing to do with generating growth, economic growth. It's purely about imperial tribute. And this is one of the things that I find most almost difficult to grasp about the politicians in this country and France, Germany, Italy, the people who queued up around Donald Trump's desk at the White House.
Wonderful picture.
A couple of weeks ago. What I find quite incredible is they're unable to articulate even the interests of their own capitalist class in their own countries. When Ursula von der Leyen goes to Trump's golf course in Scotland and sits there and gets told by him that the European Union is going to buy X amount billion pounds of US gas, X billion pounds of US weapons, they're going to have 15% tariffs on EU exports to the United States, and sits there and takes it, it kind of confounds my understanding of who these people are supposed to represent. It's clear that there's a real problem in Europe, in the European industry, European capitalist interests. Their political representation has collapsed into this slavish vassalage towards the United States. And that's quite worrying, actually. I mean, it's worrying, obviously, because it's going to impact badly on European citizens. But it's also, you wonder what that's storing up. Is there going to be some strong man or strong woman who comes along next year and say, these people have betrayed you, I'm your true leader? Because, that, I think, is a real concern. I mean, it's a bit speculative, but there's a vacuum.
Historically, there are precedents for this. Yeah. How does this work in terms of change? Now, I've read your chapter on the just transition. So the transition from a defence, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the Lucas aerospace experiment in the 70s. Can you explain a bit about your idea of a just transition and how that would work?
Well, as you pointed out, for decades, the workforce, experts, all that kind of thing, have come up with repeated, very compelling, very well researched examples of how you can have a transition, within an industry, the defence sector, for example, but also other industrial sectors too, and things like base closures as well, a lot of well-documented plans and actually quite successful developments around that kind of thing, how that can work, right? There's no question about that. And obviously en route, you've had, the incorporation of sustainability and environmental concerns and all that. All the plans, everything exists. What is lacking is the political will, So, I feel very strongly it's not up to the peace movement or even the trade union movement to come up with any more bright ideas about how this should be done. And we just need that kind of political leadership to bring that change about, And even, during the kind of Corbyn leadership and all that kind of thing, of the Labour Party, that wasn't advanced as much as it could have been. I know that at that time, Jeremy Corbyn was saying we need to have a shadow, what's the word, defence diversification agency and all that kind of thing. We need to get that up and running. It didn't really get up and running. The trade union kind of mainstream trade union movement didn't really seem to be kind of seized of that, and in my opinion that's because there is this idea out there, quite false, as Alex has already pointed out, that somehow jobs are provided by military spending. Repeatedly you go to a meeting, about all this kind of thing and about welfare, not warfare and all that, and someone stands up and says, yeah, but what about the jobs? We can't get rid of nukes and all that because of the jobs. It's just, complete nonsense. And the sooner that we really fully recognise that, and understand that you can provide far more jobs in other sectors than you can in the defence sector, and defence spending is basically dead spending in terms of generating economic growth, as Alex has already pointed out. That just has to be understood. So we need the kind of political change to enable that jobs transition and that industrial and economic transition to take place.
And arms spending is the least jobs, or one of the least jobs
Yes,
rich
you made that
areas
quite
of
clear
investment.
yeah.
If you think, I mean, the most jobs rich area of sector of the economy is health.
Health.
Followed by other care and education sectors. But even if you think about the engineering skills that are needed in the defence sector, in the arms sector, those are the skills that we're missing, that we're lacking at the moment in so many other sectors. So it's a cause of national shame, or it should be, that we've got this 100 billion or something high-speed rail line from Acton to Solihull, which can't even connect to the two biggest cities in Britain, city centre to city centre. It's not going to work. It's been sabotaged by corporate interests who've got no interest in building a proper high-speed rail network. But you look at China; they've built the world's largest high-speed rail network in 10 years. They're now developing maglev trains that can travel at speeds of in excess of 600 kilometres an hour.
Renewable energy at an amazing...
Renewable energy. I mean, all of these are the key... and then, I mean, even the capitalist class understand that they're failing in Europe to be able to deliver any of these real economic projects. If you look at the Draghi report, Mario Draghi, the former former ECB, European Central Bank governor and commissioner, European Union commissioner, who wrote the report on the European economy and its lagging productivity and efficiency last year, which has been totally buried, by the way. When it came out, he pointed out in Europe there is no major company developing key cutting edge IT skills. There is no investment going on in this area. All of those companies are either owned by Americans or they're Chinese, or in some cases Russian, actually. But the European economy is failing because we're failing to invest in R&D. We're failing to invest in the real infrastructure that our countries need. And you can see this in this country, particularly with housing, where there's this terrible housing crisis. There are not enough houses. The houses and flats that have been built are often built for speculation, for sale.
Exchange value rather than use value.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you see that all over London. Older flats that have been around before the current speculative boom are in a terrible state of repair and need massive amounts of insulation and repair and renewal and all the rest of it. All of that work, all of that investment is real value that needs to be created and delivered.
Well, you made that point very well about productive investment and non-productive investment. I read recently about the Alan Turing Institute, I don't know if you saw that, which is the leading AI institute in this country. It's the government, as Peter Kyle, I think it is the technology minister, has declared that its funding is going to be now directed towards security and defence. This is the leading AI investment opportunity in this country. But I want to go back to the idea of trade union role in this. So, when Elbit was, the Palestine Action or whoever it was invaded Elbit and other factories, and then, you think, okay, they're having an effect there. But my thought was always, well, imagine if the workers at Elbit found tools and they said, we're not going to do this anymore. Similarly to what Italian dockers have done, for example, and others around Europe.
I think it was the first demand or appeal that came out of Palestine and Gaza, after the onslaught began, was to trade unionists to stop the arms flow to Israel. And okay, there've been some attempts, people have tried in different ways, dockers, port workers, some of them have, done great work and prevented that, not only in Europe, obviously, but in India in particular, the, huge kind of protests and, blockages taking place there as well. But here, we haven't really seen that taking place, and you do have to ask yourself why it was that almost 3 years ago at the TUC, a motion came forward, I think it was from the GMB, Alex can correct me, if I'm wrong, it was basically in favour of massively increased arms spending, in favour of the war, and actually, when it was very narrowly passed, for a period, the TUC had a policy of demanding more arms spending than actually the Tory government was doing, But then on the other side, there was a fight back against that, which is still continuing, and that has to continue because, as one of the speakers in that debate at that time said, never forget, there's a worker on both ends of a bayonet. It was the kind of minority out of which, the kind of communist movement and the kind of strong left movement arose, against war and against imperialism, and that struggle is still ongoing today, and the peace movement is, pretty much globally across Europe, in Britain, 100% against military spending, against NATO, against war, and this is why it's so important through things like the Alternative Defence Review to try and, revive that fantastic relationship between the peace movement and the trade union movement for both peace and socialism.
Which, if I'm not mistaken, happened. I mean, Unite officially, they have no policy, I think, against the war in Palestine. But I think their conference, they voted to support anybody who came out and strike or protest against the work that they were doing wherever they were based.
That debate continues within Unite and within other unions. That I wanted to just say something about where the Alternative Defence Review came from, because it originated in a debate inside my union, inside the RMT, which called for the labour movement to develop a alternative for peace, an alternative foreign policy, an alternative economic policy for peace, because of the concerns that we had about this rising tide of militarism within our movement. If you go back to the GMB motion, which Kate alluded to, I think at the 2022 TUC conference, that motion calling for 2.5% of GDP to be spent on arms was the policy at the time that was being put forward by Donald Trump when he was in opposition. He was clamouring for 2.5%. Boris Johnson, or whoever it was, Sunak at the time, Sunak, the British Prime Minister, was on 2% and was being barracked by Trump in America and the GMB in this country to increase the proportion of GDP spent on arms. That's a disgraceful position to be in. So the reason that we demanded that the movement start stepping up and putting forward an alternative is because we were so alarmed at this. And we were also aware that this same alarm was being expressed by other unions all over the world. So the Australians, I mean, we're very close in my union to the Maritime Union of Australia, which is a very, very important trade union with a magnificent political tradition of solidarity and anti-war activism. They blockaded ships going to Vietnam during the Vietnam War. They wouldn't deliver goods going to South Africa under apartheid. They have a history going right back to the 1930s of anti-war activism, including stopping pig iron being exported to Japan after the invasion of China. But the MUA, the Maritime Union of Australia, came to us and said, look, we're really concerned about this new thing called AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US Pact Treaty, which is going to bring nuclear submarines to the Southern Hemisphere, to the Indian Ocean for the first time. Paid for by Australia.
Built in US.
Some of them apparently built in Barrow-in-Furness, some of them built in the US. But the point is, they were saying this is making what is a non-nuclear zone. I mean, since the British let off nuclear tests in Australia, Australia has been a nuclear-free zone, and it's nuclearising the seas in the southern Indian Ocean. So they came to us and said, we're really concerned about this. We want a partner in Britain who we can link with, a trade union partner in Britain who can develop our critique of why this is the wrong policy for people in Australia, the wrong policy for people in Britain, and we've tried to work with other unions to do that. So I think this is part of a much broader international...
So there is a movement afoot to realign that. Just to finish off this fascinating discussion, because I know you've got to get away, Kate, is what next? So you brought this out. We had an interesting juncture now in our political history where a new party is being formed. How do you see, where's the possibility of getting this to become official policy of, let's say, the new party, and to get the trade union movement as a whole and the peace movement obviously already behind it, but to develop, what's the next stage for this?
Well, I think that getting that kind of policy embraced and adopted by the new party would be an enormous step forward. I think that it's hard to know precisely at this moment how that will develop, because we're all on tenterhooks to see what the structure of the party will be, what the opportunities will be for democratic debate, how policy will be arrived at and so on. But for me, that party will be as nothing if it doesn't have a clear anti-militarist, anti-NATO, anti-nuclear and anti-war party. If it's not that, there's no point in having it. There are plenty of other parties with kind of other positions and so on, but that has to be at the core of it, because those are the challenges facing the world today. And it's no good having a kind of good position on a national health service if that is in a vacuum, you know, which isn't informed by, are we going to war? What's happening with, you know, all those kinds of situations. What about the increasing risk of nuclear war, for example? What about people's real and genuine security? Freeing up money from the military to actually spend on things like the health service. So we need that big picture approach, and I very much hope that people who get involved in the new party will be really pushing that forward, so it will be able to make a real difference in British and global politics.
And indeed, I mean, we've sent a copy to Jeremy Corbyn, and indeed Jeremy very kindly put on a parliamentary launch for the Alternative Defence Review, so he attended it despite being very busy, and he's very impressed with it because he's told me so. So I know that there are people who are listening to the arguments that are being put forward there. I mean, I think some of those arguments need to be updated. There's new information, and there are new twists on this. It's just come to my attention, and I should have known about this, but I didn't, that Kinetic, which is the former DERA, the Defence...
now privately owned, if I'm not mistaken.
The privatised Defence Research Agency, Kinetic's largest shareholder, is the biggest single financial backer of Reform UK and Nigel Farage. Now, there's a lot of connections between the arms industry and these adventurous, to put it politely, politicians like Farage. No doubt Kinetic supports politicians from all over the political map, but their biggest shareholder is Nigel Farage's biggest backer. So I think we need to look very carefully at some of these questions as politics in this country gets more and more febrile in the run-up to the next general election.
I agree with you. This is absolutely essential that the new party adopts something like this as policy, and I think it's, for many people, it's becoming a red line that any support for NATO is just a no. You know, we know there's plenty of other arguments in Zionism and which are emerging, which people will have their own ideas on. But in terms of the future of the world, this is pretty important. So, thank you so much for your time. It's been brilliant.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah,
nice
great. Very informative. Yeah, all very good.
Boom.
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 Boom. Two booms. Yeah, it's great. Thanks very much. Yeah.